You are listening to From the Sea, a podcast series produced by South China Sea Studies. This program provides valuable insights from experts around the world on geopolitical and security developments, with regards to the South China Sea as an area in a connected maritime landscape. In today's episode, Dr. Evan Laksmana, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia Military Modernization, International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Ms. Jane Chan-Gedin, Senior Fellow and Coordinator, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University. We'll discuss with our host about ASEAN, China and United States military exercises in the region.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of From the Sea podcast series from South China Sea Studies. Today, we have a very special episode because joining us will be two ASEAN scholars. So not just one, but two at the same time. Yes, you heard that right. Miss Jane Chen from IISS Singapore and Mr. Evan Laksmana from IISS Indonesia. And also another thing special about this podcast is that the names of the podcast is From the Sea, and we're actually sitting by the sea at the moment. Okay, yeah, the topic today will revolve around US and China regional military strategies, especially those that are conducted via combined exercises in the regions. And I believe for Evans, this is the topic that you focus on in your recent report named Scripted Order Combined Military Exercise in the Asia Pacific. Yes?
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And Jane, who has done a lot of research on maritime security in Southeast Asia. So hopefully you could provide your insights on the topics as well.
Sure.
So maybe to start off, I would like to raise the questions regarding Evan's report findings. So I think in your research, you have pointed out the differences between US-led and China-led military exercise in the Asia Pacific. Could you briefly summarize it for our audience?
Well, so basically, there are two ways of thinking about military exercise, right? Because exercise is never just a one perspective. It's always from both sides. And on the US-China side of the viewpoint, I think it's clear that the US and China values and thinks about and plans for these exercises in very different ways. In any future regional conflict in Asia, any US war plan would require a strong military alliance to work. And so those exercises are crucial for any future military operations. The US essentially does not plan on fighting alone in Asia. And so the value of those exercises are very different compared to China. China is not planning to fight a war with allies. China doesn't do allies, as it always says. And so the value is largely for symbolic, strategic, and dare I say, occasional intelligence gathering function as opposed to actual war preparation. So I think that's how I would, at least at the basic level, separate how US and China view exercises. Now, on the other side of the house, for the Southeast Asians, they also see these exercises in different ways. Many Southeast Asians who have done the most with the US sees exercises with the US as a way to improve their readiness, test out some new operational concepts, perhaps new equipment, and in general, of course, strengthen its ability to keep the US presence in the region much more anchored. But I don't think it should be seen as a strategic alignment choices by the Southeast Asian states who value these exercises for the security goods, not necessarily for the strategic alignment goods. For China, it's probably the same as well because of the concerns around issues like the South China Sea and others. There isn't a likelihood that all of the exercises with Southeast Asians will develop into highly complex kind of exercises, because I think that's a next step in the trust scale that's not there yet. So if you look at exercises, you have to essentially see it from both sides of the partnership, from the US or China, as well as from the Southeast Asia. But also you have to look at it from a spectrum. Some exercises are much more simple. Some exercises are much more complex, involving more people, involving more planning, more proficiency. And so exercises do have their operational and technical value, but for the region, it also definitely carries strategic value beyond those military to military benefits as well.
Mm. And because the theme of the conference is touch upon the issues of narrative, right? So one narrative that I often hear about military exercise in the regions, especially those that are led by big power, is that one side would do something and then the other would say that, oh, this is an escalation, this is a provocative action, right? So would you say because the military exercises led by the US and China are so different in terms of nature and in terms of scale, would you say one type is more provocative than the others?
Well, provocative is in the eye of the beholder, right?
Right.
A simple search
To
and
the region, to
search,
Southeast
yeah,
Asia, for example.
a simple search and rescue NHADR exercises for disaster relief, for example, can be as simple as a gesture of goodwill. But if you deploy certain assets, it also can be seen as getting ready to project force across a certain set of islands or waters. So provocation, being provocative or not, depends on the eyes of the beholder. So we cannot, in all honesty, define certain types of exercises as more or less provocative without accounting for the other side. Exercises are also valued differently by the participants, right? If it's about proficiency for certain operational needs, then it's really hard to say it's provocative because those are specific security needs like HADR or search and rescue or even anti-submarine warfare can be seen as a way to boost deterrence and therefore actually deter conflict theory. So when it comes to exercises, the challenge is to parse out the complexity, the durability, the quality of those exercises in a way that we can assign a certain, shall we say, value assessment and look at the value for the participants as well as how the exercises are then well received or not. And so, with the narrative game about which exercises are provocative, are we saying China's anti submarine warfare exercises with Pakistan is not provocative to India? It may not be for China and Pakistan, but it certainly is for India, or vice versa, right? If the US and Philippines start to deploy certain capabilities that China feels could influence any Taiwan contingency, then China can think of it as provocative, but Philippines probably would not. And so I don't really find being provocative or not as a necessarily analytically useful category to measure exercises. It is at best an incomplete one.
Mm. How about Jane? What do you think about big powers exercises in the South China Sea? Do you think those that are participated by any South Asian country, do you think they are constructive to regional peace overall, as some of these Southeast Asia countries want to promote?
Hmm. So first of all, we must really understand, right, the intent and purposes of why some of these countries are here in Southeast Asia. I think for one, let's not forget that, the Southeast Asian waters is a very, very important sea lines of communication for a lot of extra-regional countries, including some of these major powers, right? Number two, the context is also very important, right? While you crouch it in the sense that, when you put these exercises next to, some of the regional tensions and conflicts, that is one barometer in assessing, right, why these extra-regional countries are here. But let's not forget that, even when we look at the South China Sea dispute, so to speak, right, and the maritime tensions that we see in this part of the world, I always argue that when we look at the South China Sea, there are various dimensions to it as well. Of course, the dispute that you highlighted, I would assume that you are referring to the territorial and maritime disputes, right? That's one dimension, right? But apart from that, we heard everyone talking about, there is the functional and practical, dimension into exercises, looking at, specific maritime security threats and challenges that we have in this part of the world that has nothing to do with the disputes, right? There are various maritime security threats that would require regional countries to work with one another, including, with extra-regional partners as well, right? And then, if we look at the South China Sea as, the broader sea lines of communication and how, the freedom of navigation in these part of the world has, very real implications to some of these great powers, then, that could be another reason why they feel the need to be present, right? So the presence in that sense, also can take various dimensions too, right? Number one, of course, is, expression of their own interests. Number two is it could be also viewed as, them showing solidarity with regional partners, right? So earlier on, the example that you highlighted is that, some of these exercises are done independently without partnership with regional countries. So if the view is that, freedom of navigation permits, right, all countries to operate in any part of this, regional waters, of course, within the prescribed, right, passage regimes, right, different maritime zones will have different passage regimes ascribed to all navies around the world. And if it's done according to international law, then I don't see this as, objectionable in that sense, right?
I see.
But again, right, the narrative matters, because when you then, highlight that, why some of these activities should be viewed as, potentially provocative, right? The exercise themselves is probably not the only, elements that is taken into consideration. Then you have to look into also, what are some of the PR, right? The diplomatic PR side of the house in how these are being publicized, right? Because whilst, if we look at Evans' report, you will see that, there are more exercises that are being done than those reported. Right. So why are some of these exercises being reported so widely and sometimes positive light, sometimes negative light, and why some go, unnoticed?
Yeah.
Right. So to me, we always have to look at the individual nature of the exercises that you speak about. But I do want to go back in terms of, everybody has a right, you're right, to ply these waters in accordance to international law.
And do you think the tendencies of the ASEAN collectively as a group being involved in conducting military exercises, especially in the vicinity or inside the South China Sea, do you think that is a future trend that it's going to be more popular or more widely accepted?
So to me, generalizing military exercises in that sense is not very helpful in terms of analyzing what is actually happening on the ground. Right. Whilst you are insinuating that, these sorts of exercises is targeted as a show of force, or at least that's how I interpret your question to be. There are exercises in regional waters amongst ASEAN countries and some with extra-regional partners that has a functional objective. Right. So that, in my mind, should have no, connotation to infer that, it has anything to do with, the conflict or the tension that's happening here. Because like I mentioned, the South China Sea disputes, right? It's only one dimension of the maritime security, developments that we are observing in this part of the world that requires attention. Not just of the Southeast Asian countries, but also, of extra-regional partners.
If you also switch or add a different context to exercises, in addition to what Jane said, which is looking at exercises again as a spectrum of defense relationship more broadly, it does, on the positive side, signify a level of trust, because the most simple defense engagement is visits, and then it gradually moves forward to joint activities and then joint exercises until, for example, the most complex one would be what is now known interchangeability of defense production, like AUKUS. And so if you look at it from the context of the spectrum of defense engagement, exercises is also a sign of growing trust. You don't jump from never having any meetings and engagement to suddenly doing a joint activity like exercises together, because in exercises you inadvertently will have to reveal something about your capabilities, your concept of operations, your habits, or your simple proficiency of doing military things. And without a certain level of trust, that will be very difficult. And if you go back to the history for Southeast Asia, the reason why ASEAN could flourish today, partly because of how Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines and Thailand did a lot of military exercises together for a long time before it became a norm for the great powers to do stuff with us. We have done our own exercises with each other for a while, and it wasn't easy, I think, for the original founding members of ASEAN to do that. But that helps solidify the trust and the relationship. So on the positive side, if you want to change your lens, exercises is a sign of trust too. So what happens in the South China Sea, as you mentioned, that being emboldened, I wouldn't call 30 years later, after there's a potential conflict in the South China Sea, doing exercises as emboldened. I think, if anything, people can say this is a normal mode of concern for a long time. Why did you wait 40 years until you have a joint ASEAN exercises, right? And so I think this is a natural evolution of the ASEAN Security Community Project. The interesting challenge is that the data will tell us some ASEAN countries are more networked with each other than others. And interestingly, Vietnam is an outlier in that network. Vietnam is one of the few countries in ASEAN who has not had a major military exercise with its own ASEAN member states. And so, in that sense, there is a question mark there as well. What's stopping Vietnam from doing more military exercises with its fellow ASEAN members?
Well, speaking of trust, last month there was a series of extensive and very lengthy exercise between Russia and China, right? It was a little bit noticeable, not because it was extended in terms of time and in terms of geographical scope, but then also there was multiple forces that were involved, and there was a patrol from their law enforcement forces in between of two different periods exercise. So would you say that there's also a increasing amount of trust there?
I think certainly there's increasing amount of collaboration that we've seen. Whether or not that reflects a genuine trust or a temporary alignment of interests is certainly something worth debating. But I do think there is a growing concern, particularly in European capitals, the growth in collaboration and coordination and sharing between Russia, China, and North Korea poses a new kind of triangular risk that crosses the Euro-Atlantic as well as the Indo-Pacific. Now, whether or not those risks are overblown or not well sufficiently discussed is a matter of debate. But I do think that given the situation that we're in, an interesting feature to that Russia-China relationship is whether or not, as Jane says, there is a larger context beyond just the exercises. Whether we're looking at it from a broader foreign policy context, whether it's about Ukraine, or is it part of a long-held process between Russia and China? That's what I think we haven't really quite understood. Right now, there's a sense of instant analysis that everything is about Ukraine, everything is about Middle East. Some of it is, yeah, of course, but I find it highly unlikely that a dynamic between two great major powers happened only in the last 2 years.
And you talked about effectiveness of exercises either. So I think I'm going to want to turn to James for this one. We talked about Chinese exercises, and I want to focus more on US exercises. So in the South China Sea, my impressions is that with the so-called integrated deterrence mantra, they have reduced their freedom of navigation operations, but they shifted their military attentions and assets and resources into exercises with their allies and partners more in the South China Sea. Would you share that sentiment?
So rather than saying that, US independently shift the model of engagement with Southeast Asia, have you considered that, this could perhaps be a request by Southeast Asian partners as well, right? In terms of, how to enhance their partnership, what is most practical, what's most useful for their Southeast Asian partners. So if you think of it from that angle, and if the US is responding to requests of partners to do more exercises rather than simply freedom of navigation, operations, then in a way I would say that, this is a positive, right? It's a positive development in the relationship and partnership that we're looking at with, extra-regional partners, especially with the US here. And then if you look at the nature of some of these exercises, right, a lot of it are for functional practical purposes. And I think, again, this helps for us to think about how, working with the US in building regional capacity, right, and for X number of, issues that they are exercising on, again, it's a positive trend beyond just thinking about, the disputes and the tension in this part of the world. So focusing on maritime security more broadly, building regional capacity more broadly, enabling regional countries to, doing self-help eventually, if need be, having a certain level of interoperability with the US. I think all these are positive trends in the broader, consideration for maritime security development in this part of the world.
How about the counter arguments, which I've also seen some people talked about within the regions, which is, reducing FONOP is because FONOP is the most visible way for you to show commitment so far, and now reducing it and shifting it to something else, even if you try to convince your partner that you're not decreasing your strategic attentions here, but your actions show that obviously your focal point has been shifted.
That's an interesting perspective because in my limited conversation with, our American counterparts, I don't think they would say that they have actually reduced, one for the other. They have not traded one for the other, right? Even the
But given
FONOPs,
the limited
no, but
number of ships and the rotation,
But let's not forget that, FONOPS is not just about showing up in ships, right? There are various dimensions within FONOPS that, the US can operationalize to still make it part of a FONOPS. So in that sense, again, I don't think it's a matter of trading one for the other or swapping one for the other. I would like to think that US talking more to its Southeast Asian partners, right? And working on building the needs for Southeast Asian maritime capability in that sense.
I also think one cannot discount the possibility that it's not driven by the US at all. A lot of the momentum that we now see in the region, particularly around the alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia and the Philippines, they're self-driven, as in driven by the thinking and the interests and the calculus of those countries, as opposed to the US masterminding everything. And so some of it, I think, is, partly driving the momentum that we see. And if that momentum takes a life on its own in terms of activities like exercises, it's only natural, because if you feel you need to draw closer to your allies, and then when you start to figure out what do we need from each other to be able to operate effectively, how do you know that? You only know that by doing exercises. Why? Because that's how you do the proof of concept. Actually, when we do this, we realize we need problems in communications to be sorted. Or we need problems on logistics to be sorted. Oh, actually, we don't have runways that we need to actually create. So some of these things is not a singularly driven dynamic by the US shifting its strategy or shifting resources, but it's also the momentum in the alliances. And whether or not that momentum is justifiable or it's driven by domestic politics, the point is simply These regional countries have their own agency, and they help shape the dynamic for good or for bad.
Of course, I won't discount the fact that sometimes some of this is good photo opportunity, right? A good photo op for a particular political purpose, but there's a limit to how much you can do, right? If that's the only purpose, right, you would question, right, the amount of resources that is being invested in this, which technically you could achieve without actually mounting an exercise.
And for Singapore, Singapore is also a very particular case within ASEAN because Singapore is able to conduct exercises with both US and China, and not just once, but I would say annually. Yes.
Well, with China, I
With
think
China.
the recent exercise is only the second in the last 10 years.
Okay.
So I think we cannot put it in parallel with what the Singapore does with our US counterpart, right? But even then, right, looking at, I think there's a need for us to understand China more. I believe, our Navy will need to know their counterpart a little bit more. And if you look at, the nature of the exercise, you know that, a lot of this it felt as if like it's the first time again, right? Because there's a very long gap. So, I'm with Evan in terms of we should really view this as trust building and friendship building, right? And to do more, we actually have to make it more frequent, more consistent. And in my mind, it's not going to be at the level of what we are doing with our American partners, anytime soon.
But are you aware if Singapore has ever been put under pressure from one side just because you organize exercise with the other side?
No, I'm not aware of that, but I won't discount the possibility of that. Having said that, I would say that, again, looking at the frequency of, and the depth of our relationship with the US, I don't think, the two exercises that we have with China would pose any, questionable threat in that sense, right? And, I believe that Singapore is looking at, collaborating and working with many more partners, not just with China as well. So if I have it my way, I would see there to be an upward trend. Not just for Singapore, but for regional countries as well. But again, I think regional countries also have to really consider, as everyone said, what's the intent of purposes. Because, every time you mount an exercise, it's a huge amount of resources being invested. And that, its objective ought to be a clear one.
Also, compared to what other countries in Southeast Asia have done with both US and China, what Singapore is doing with China is really, really small. Consider Thailand's exercise with China, as well as Cobra Gold with the US, or Indonesia's exercise with Chinese Special Forces, and then with Super Garuda Shield. So most Southeast Asian countries have done both with different scales and different pace and different scenarios. And this is where it's interesting because I don't think we fully understand the thinking and the logic and the dynamic of these exercises. And we tend to see them as a snapshot of what's happening the last 2 years. But in fact, studies will show exercises is a regional currency that's been around for a long time. You just don't really understand it very much.
Well, I guess the main takeaway for me from our conversations is that military exercises, definitely you have to look into the substance of each activities rather than lumping them all under the same umbrella. And then you have to contextualize it in the individual country context, as well as the specific intentions for each activity.
And let's not forget, it's really just one dimension of the bilateral relations, or any sets of bilateral relations that you're talking about as well.
Well, I believe that is the end of today's episode of From the Sea. Once again, thank you, Shane. Thank you, Evan, for joining us.
This is the end of this episode. Stay tuned for our upcoming discussion, which will be released on Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, as well as on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.
I get caught looking in the mirror on the regular, and what I see there resembles some competitor. I see things behind